Shadows of the past. Claire adjusted the last of the vibrant red roses in the towering centerpiece and stepped back, surveying the grand hall. Her lips curved into a hesitant smile, but her stomach churned with unease. The place looked like something out of a dream. Chandeliers dripped with crystals, their prisms casting rainbows on the polished floor. The walls were adorned with silk drapes, and guests in elegant attire mingled over glasses of champagne. It was her wedding day, the day she had imagined since she was a little girl, yet something about it felt eerily hollow. She smoothed the intricate lace of her gown, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the tiny pearl buttons on her sleeve. A lifetime of modest living had made this opulence foreign to her. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the effort. Richard had promised her the world. But as she stood there, a nagging doubt crept into her thoughts. She shook her head, willing the unease to vanish. This is pre-wedding jitters, she told herself. That's all. Her best friend, Maddie, bustled over, the train of Claire's dress draped over her arm. There you are, she chirped. You've got guests already speculating how stunning you'll look walking down the aisle. Claire chuckled, though the sound lacked conviction. Maybe I should have added a few more lace details to the dress, she teased. Maddie caught her tone and frowned. Hey, stop that. You're stunning. Richard won't be able to keep his eyes off you. The mention of Richard softened Claire's smile. She thought about his easy laugh, the way he always held her hand as if he never wanted to let go. That's the man she was marrying, the man who made her feel safe, seen, and loved. Yet a shiver coursed through her as she caught sight of his mother, Eleanor, moving through the crowd like a panther surveying her territory. Eleanor's sharp gaze sliced through the room, briefly landing on Claire. A flicker of disapproval crossed the older woman's face before she returned to smiling stiffly at a guest. Claire clenched her fists at her sides. Richard had assured her time and again that Eleanor's opinion didn't matter. But Eleanor's coldness still lingered in Claire's mind like a storm cloud threatening rain. Upstairs, in the privacy of the groom's suite, Richard leaned against the window, staring out at the estate's sprawling gardens. The sunlight glinted off the fountains and perfectly manicured hedges, but it offered no comfort. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, his jaw tight and his expression stormy. His mother's words from the night before echoed in his head. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Richard, Eleanor had said, her voice dripping with icy finality. You think love is enough. Love doesn't maintain a family empire. If you marry Claire, you'll lose everything. Your inheritance, your position, the family's respect. He had argued, of course. He had spoken of Claire's warmth, her resilience, and the way she brought light into his life. But Eleanor's warning had struck deeper than he wanted to admit. Could he really abandon the world he had known for someone who didn't understand its rules? The pressure bore down on him, threatening to snap his resolve. Richard's groomsman, Greg, entered the room, startling him out of his thoughts. You ready? Greg asked, adjusting his bow tie. Yeah, Richard lied, his voice barely above a whisper. Greg frowned. You don't sound ready. Richard turned away from the window, forcing a smile. Just thinking. Back in the bridal suite, Claire paced, her veil fluttering with each hurried step. He's late, she muttered, glancing at the clock. Richard should have been waiting at the altar by now, his boyish grin calming her nerves as she descended the aisle. Something wasn't right. Maddie tried to reassure her, but Claire caught snippets of hushed conversations from the hallway. A staff member passed by, her face pale, whispering urgently to another. Claire's heart raced. Her father stepped into the room, his expression grim. Claire, he began, his voice thick with worry. There's something you need to know. Before he could finish, the door burst open, and Greg stumbled in, his face ashen. He's gone, Greg blurted, his voice cracking. Claire froze. What? She whispered, as if speaking too loudly would make it real. Greg stammered, holding up a crumpled piece of paper. Richard, he left this. Claire snatched the note, her hands trembling. The words stared back at her, a cruel punch to the gut. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." Her knees buckled, and Maddie barely caught her in time. The room spun as waves of shock, humiliation, and heartbreak crashed over her. She clutched the note, the promise of a lifetime together, dissolving into a cruel lie. The grand hall descended into chaos as news of Richard's disappearance spread. Guests whispered behind their hands, their pitying gazes cutting into Claire like knives. Eleanor stood at the center of the storm, her expression cold and unmoved. It was as if she had expected this all along. Claire wanted to scream, to demand answers, to claw her way out of the nightmare. But her father gently led her away from the prying eyes and murmured condolences, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. "You don't have to stay here, Claire," he said softly. "Let's go home." That night, back in her childhood bedroom, Claire sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing her wedding dress. The lace and tulle that had once made her feel like a princess now felt like chains, binding her to a humiliation she couldn't escape. Tears streamed down her face as she stared out the window, the stars blurring into streaks of light. How could he? How could Richard walk away without a word, without even giving her a chance to fight for what they had? Her love for him curdled into something darker, a mix of anger and grief that gnawed at her insides. With shaking hands, she unclasped the veil and set it on her nightstand. Tomorrow, she vowed, she would leave. She didn't know where she would go or what she would do, but she couldn't stay here. Not where the echoes of her broken dreams haunted every corner. Claire may have been abandoned, but she refused to be defeated. A spark of determination flickered in the ashes of her heartbreak. She would rebuild her life, without Richard. A new chapter, a new life. The small town disappeared in the rearview mirror as Claire gripped the steering wheel tighter, her hands trembling but her resolve firm. The morning sun peeked over the horizon, casting golden rays onto the empty road ahead. Her car, a beat-up sedan that had seen better days, was packed with her few belongings, a suitcase of clothes, her favorite books, and the remains of a life she was determined to leave behind. She didn't look back. The town held nothing for her now, no future, no safety, and no Richard. The man who had once promised her the world had turned her life into rubble, but she couldn't let his betrayal define her. She had to move forward, no matter how daunting the path ahead seemed. Claire had no clear destination in mind, only the need to escape. A distant city several hours away had been the first place she'd circled on the map. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a fresh start, a chance to breathe, to build something new. By the time she reached the city, her savings had dwindled to barely enough for a week in a cheap motel. The motel smelled faintly of mildew, and the walls were thin enough for her to hear the arguments of the couple next door. But it was hers, at least for now. Claire sat on the edge of the squeaky mattress, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the dresser. Her wedding dress had been replaced with a pair of worn jeans and a plain t-shirt. Her face, though tired and pale, no longer held the anguish of the day she'd been abandoned. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. She had to find work, any work, and secure a roof over her head before her funds ran out. That thought alone kept her grounded. The next day, she walked the streets with a stack of printed resumes, handing them out to every shop, cafe, and business that had a "Help Wanted" sign in the window. Most places either ignored her or said they weren't hiring anymore. But by late afternoon, she stumbled upon a small cafe tucked into a corner of a busy street. The barista needed sign taped to the window was handwritten and slightly crooked. Claire stepped inside, the aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods immediately washing over her. Behind the counter stood an older woman with silver-streaked hair tied back in a ponytail. She glanced up from her ledger as Claire approached. "Looking for coffee, or are you here about the job?" Claire hesitated, her nerves catching up to her. "The job," she said quickly, holding out her resume. The woman looked her up and down, then took the paper without glancing at it. "You ever worked in a cafe before?" "No, but I'm a fast learner." Claire replied, standing straighter. The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. What makes you think you can handle it? Mornings are busy. You'll be on your feet all day. Claire's jaw tightened, her desperation bubbling to the surface. Because I have no other choice, she said, her voice firm. The woman's expression softened just a fraction, and after a moment she nodded. Show up at 7 tomorrow morning. Don't be late. The next morning, Claire arrived early, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She learned quickly, shadowing the other employees and mastering the espresso machine by the end of her shift. It wasn't glamorous work, but the steady rhythm of pouring lattes and ringing up customers gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. As the days turned into weeks, Claire began to settle into a routine. She found a tiny apartment on the outskirts of the city. The rent was low, and the place was little more than a room with a kitchenette and a bed, but it was hers. Every day, she worked long shifts at the cafe, saving what little money she could and slowly piecing her life back together. Yet, in the quiet moments, when she returned to her empty apartment at night, memories of Richard haunted her. His laugh, his touch, the way he'd looked at her when he promised forever. Those memories clung to her like ghosts, refusing to let her go. 2 months into her new life, Claire began feeling off. The fatigue she had initially blamed on stress grew worse. Mornings became a battle with nausea, and her appetite all but vanished. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling shift, she decided to stop by the pharmacy on her way home. The box felt heavy in her hands as she walked through her apartment door. She sat on the bathroom floor, staring at the pregnancy test as it confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. She was pregnant. Claire's breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening with panic. Tears blurred her vision as a whirlwind of emotions consumed her. Richard's face flashed in her mind, and for a brief moment, she hated him all over again. But then, as she pressed a trembling hand to her stomach, a flicker of something else stirred within her. Hope. This child was a piece of her, a new life to nurture and protect. She wouldn't let the past overshadow what could be a future filled with love and purpose. Her first ultrasound appointment brought another shock. The doctor, calm and composed, delivered the news with a faint smile. Congratulations, Miss Hayes. You're having quadruplets. Claire blinked, her mouth dry. 4, she croaked. 4 healthy babies, the doctor confirmed, showing her the screen. Tiny shapes flickered with life, their heartbeats a rapid symphony that echoed through the room. The weight of responsibility hit Claire like a tidal wave. 4 lives growing inside her. 4 futures depending on her. She left the clinic clutching the ultrasound photo like a lifeline, her mind reeling as she tried to process the enormity of it all. The months that followed were a blur of preparation and challenges. Claire juggled work at the cafe with doctor appointments and the growing exhaustion that came with her pregnancy. Her coworkers rallied around her, offering support in ways she hadn't expected. Mrs. Sanders, the cafe owner, became a quiet source of strength, slipping extra food into Claire's bag at the end of her shifts. For you and those little ones, she'd say with a wink. The city, once foreign and intimidating, began to feel like home. Neighbors she barely knew offered hand-me-down baby clothes and furniture, their kindness overwhelming her. Claire realized she wasn't alone, not entirely. When the day came to give birth, Claire was terrified. But as she held Lucas, Noah, Liam, and Oliver for the first time, all her fear melted away. Their tiny cries filled the hospital room, and her heart swelled with a love she hadn't known was possible. She wasn't just Claire anymore. She was a mother. 4 hearts, 1 mother. The cries of her newborns filled the dimly lit hospital room, a chaotic symphony of life that overwhelmed Claire with equal parts exhaustion and awe. The nurse handed her the last of her 4 babies, tiny Oliver, whose strong lungs made him the most vocal of the bunch. Claire cradled him against her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. 4 boys, she whispered, her voice shaky with disbelief. I have 4 sons. The nurse, an older woman with kind eyes, adjusted the blanket around Oliver. And they have one remarkable mother. Claire managed a tired smile, her heart swelling as she looked down at her children. Lucas, the firstborn, lay quietly in the crib beside her, his dark eyes scanning the room with an uncanny calmness. Noah was the loudest of the group, squirming in his sleep as though he were already preparing for mischief. Liam, the smallest of the four, had a serene quality about him, while Oliver's wails echoed through the room with a determination Claire knew would define him. Her heart ached with joy and fear. Could she do this alone? Raising 4 children was a daunting task, even with a partner. Without one, it felt impossible. Yet, as she touched each of their tiny hands, she knew she had no choice. She would do it, no matter the cost. The first weeks at home were a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings and diapers. Claire's once tidy apartment transformed into a battlefield of baby bottles, burp cloths, and makeshift cribs. The exhaustion was unlike anything she'd ever known. Some nights, she cried quietly while rocking one baby in her arms and holding a bottle for another, the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her. But amidst the chaos, there were moments of pure magic. The first time Lucas smiled, a gummy, lopsided grin that melted her heart. Claire knew every sleepless night was worth it. When Noah let out a laugh, high-pitched and infectious, it reminded her that joy could still find its way into her life. Her neighbor, Rachel, became an unexpected lifeline. A young woman with a knack for organizing, Rachel started coming by after work to help. "You've got your hands full," she'd say, picking up a baby without waiting for permission. Claire was initially hesitant to accept help, but the sheer need for rest eventually won out. Rachel's assistance wasn't the only blessing. Mrs. Sanders, her boss at the cafe, continued to support her, offering flexible hours and dropping off casseroles on the weekends. Slowly, Claire built a small village around her, a network of people who saw her strength and wanted to help her succeed. One evening, as Claire sat on the floor folding baby clothes, a knock echoed through the apartment. She stood, her brow furrowing. Visitors were rare, especially unannounced ones. She opened the door to find an elderly woman holding a small worn box. "Mrs. Henderson?" Claire asked, recognizing the woman from the cafe. "Sorry to bother you, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice trembling slightly. "I heard about your boys, and I thought you could use this." She handed Claire the box, which was filled with baby blankets, pacifiers, and old but carefully preserved toys. Claire's throat tightened as she accepted the gift. "Thank you," she whispered. Mrs. Henderson placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You remind me of my daughter," she said softly. "Strong, resourceful, and full of love. Those boys are lucky to have you." Claire watched the woman leave, her words lingering like a warm embrace. As the boys grew, Claire's world revolved around them. Every milestone was a small triumph, every challenge a test of her resilience. Lucas became the quiet observer, his curious nature often leading him to examine the world with wide-eyed wonder. Noah's mischievous streak grew with him, his laughter filling the apartment as he devised new ways to climb onto furniture. Liam was gentle and empathetic, the first to cry when one of his brothers was upset, and Oliver remained her fiery spirit, always pushing boundaries and demanding attention. Their bond as brothers was unbreakable. They moved as a pack, giggling and babbling in a language only they seemed to understand. Watching them interact brought Claire a joy she couldn't put into words. Financially, life was a constant battle. Claire stretched every dollar to its limit, often skipping meals so her boys could have enough. Nights spent poring over bills left her with a heavy heart, but she refused to give up. She picked up extra shifts at the cafe when she could and even started baking cookies to sell at the local market for extra income. Despite the hardships, her love for her boys gave her strength. They were her purpose, her light in the darkness. One rainy afternoon, as the boys napped, Claire found herself staring at an old photo of Richard tucked away in a drawer. His familiar smile brought a pang of sorrow and anger. She had avoided thinking about him for years, burying the hurt under layers of responsibility and survival. But now, as her boys grew older, their resemblance to him became harder to ignore. Lucas had his calm demeanor, Liam shared his contemplative nature, and all four boys had inherited his striking eyes. The thought of Richard walking away from them, never knowing the children he had fathered, brought a fresh wave of anger. Claire slammed the drawer shut, vowing to keep her focus on the present. Richard was a part of her past, and he had no place in the life she had built for her sons. When the boys turned 3, Claire threw them a modest birthday party at the park. Balloons tied to picnic tables fluttered in the breeze as the boys ran around with their friends, their laughter echoing through the air. Rachel helped organize the party, her usual efficiency on full display. "You've done an amazing job, Claire," she said, handing her a plate of cake. Claire smiled, watching her sons blow out the candles on their cake with wide-eyed excitement. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel pride. She had come so far, building a life for her boys against all odds. As the party wound down, Claire sat on a bench, watching the boys chase each other in the fading sunlight. They were her world, her reason for fighting through every obstacle. And as the years stretched ahead, she knew she would continue to fight for them, no matter what challenges lay ahead. But as she gathered the boys to head home, a shadow fell across her path. She looked up, her heart stopping as she saw a man standing at the edge of the park. His face was older, wearier, but unmistakably familiar. Richard. He stood frozen, his eyes wide as he stared at the four boys. Claire's chest tightened as she saw the realization dawn on his face, his gaze moving from one child to the next. Her past had just walked back into her life, and with it came a storm she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Ghosts of the past. Claire's breath hitched as she stood frozen in place. Richard, the man who had shattered her world, was there, mere feet away. His face was a canvas of emotions, shock, confusion, and something she couldn't quite place. It had been 5 years, and yet the sight of him brought everything rushing back. The humiliation, the heartbreak, and the endless nights of wondering what she had done to deserve being abandoned. The boys, oblivious to the tension that crackled in the air, continued their game of tag, their laughter rising in the crisp afternoon breeze. Richard's gaze lingered on them, and Claire saw the exact moment the truth hit him. His eyes, those same piercing eyes that her sons had inherited, widened as he took in their features. Claire's protective instincts kicked in, and she stepped forward, placing herself between Richard and the boys. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice low but steady. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out at first. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she remembered all too well. "Claire, I didn't know," she scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "Didn't know what, Richard? That you walked out on me? That you left me to pick up the pieces while you disappeared without a word?" His expression faltered, guilt flickering across his face. Claire, Don't," she snapped, her voice sharper now. "Don't stand here and act like you have any right to be here." Richard's eyes darted back to the boys, who were now wrestling over a ball. "Are they mine?" Her heart clenched, but her expression remained stoic. "You don't get to ask that," she replied coldly. "You made your choice 5 years ago." Richard stepped closer, his voice soft but urgent. "Claire, please. I had no idea. I didn't." "You didn't what?" she interrupted, her anger boiling to the surface. "You didn't know I'd survive. That I'd have to raise them alone. That I'd have to work myself to the bone to give them a life." Her voice cracked, but she refused to let the tears fall. Richard flinched, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't know about them," he said finally. "I didn't know about any of this." Claire shook her head, her hands trembling as she clenched them into fists. "That's not an excuse. You left, Richard. You didn't even have the decency to tell me why." Before he could respond, the boys ran over, their faces flushed from playing. Lucas tugged on her sleeve. "Mommy, who's that?" he asked, his curious eyes glancing up at Richard. Claire's chest tightened as she looked down at her son. She forced a smile, though it felt brittle. "Just someone I used to know," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Why don't you and your brothers go play for a little longer?" Lucas hesitated, his sharp gaze flicking between her and Richard, but eventually nodded and ran back to join his brothers. "Claire," Richard began, but she cut him off with a glare. "You don't get to waltz back into my life and expect me to let you near them," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "They don't need you, Richard. They've never needed you." His expression hardened, a flicker of determination replacing his earlier guilt. "I know I screwed up. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But they're my sons, Claire. I have a right to know them." She took a step closer, her voice low and fierce. "You gave up that right when you walked away." That night, after putting the boys to bed, Claire sat alone at the kitchen table, her hands cradling a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The encounter with Richard played over and over in her mind, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, fear, and confusion. He had looked so different. Older, yes, but also broken. The confident man who had once swept her off her feet was now a shadow of his former self. She hated that a part of her still cared, still wanted to understand why he had left. But then she thought of the boys, their laughter, their resilience, their boundless energy, and her resolve hardened. She had built a life for them without him, and she wouldn't let him disrupt everything she had worked so hard to create. The next day, Claire found Richard waiting outside the cafe where she worked. She paused, considering walking the other way, but she straightened her shoulders and approached him. "What do you want, Richard?" she asked, her tone weary. He hesitated before speaking. "I just want to talk." Claire sighed, crossing her arms. "Talk about what? How you left me at the altar. How you disappeared without a word." Richard's jaw tightened. "You deserve an explanation." "An explanation," she repeated, her voice rising. "You think an explanation makes up for what you did?" "No," he admitted, his voice quiet but firm. "But you still deserve to know the truth." She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. Finally, she nodded. "Fine. You have 5 minutes." They sat at a quiet table in the cafe, the buzz of customers fading into the background as Richard began to speak. "My mother," he started, his voice tight. She threatened to cut me off if I married you. She said I'd lose everything. My inheritance, my job, everything I'd worked for." Claire's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression neutral. "I didn't want to leave you," he continued, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "But I was scared. I thought I couldn't survive without her approval. And when she showed me proof that you weren't right for our world, I believed her. I was weak, Claire. I let her manipulate me." She stared at him, her heart pounding. "So you chose money over me," she said flatly. Richard's eyes filled with regret. "I was wrong. I see that now. I've seen it every day for the past 5 years. Claire shook her head, her anger bubbling to the surface. "Do you have any idea what you did to me? To us? I had to rebuild my entire life from scratch, because you weren't strong enough to stand up for what you wanted." "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "And I'll never forgive myself for it. But when I saw them, our sons, I knew I couldn't keep running from this. From you." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You don't get to walk back into my life and expect me to forgive you, Richard. You made your choice." As she turned to leave, he called after her. "I want to be part of their lives, Claire. Please." She paused, her shoulders tense. "You'll hear from my lawyer," she said coldly, before walking away. That night, as she tucked the boys into bed, Claire's mind raced with thoughts of the future. Richard's return threatened to upend everything she had built, but she couldn't let him win. Her boys were her world, and she would do whatever it took to protect them, even if it meant facing the man who had broken her heart. The battle for family. The knock on her door came at 7:00 p.m. sharp, just as Claire finished her shift at the cafe and settled the boys with their coloring books at the dining table. Her heart sank when she saw the envelope in the courier's hand. A thick, official-looking package that practically screamed legal trouble. "Claire Hayes?" the courier asked. She nodded, her throat dry. The man handed her the envelope, tipped his hat, and disappeared down the hall before she could ask any questions. Claire stared at the envelope, her stomach churning. The boys' laughter and chatter floated from the next room, grounding her momentarily. Taking a deep breath, she tore the envelope open and scanned the letter inside. Her worst fear had come to life. Richard was petitioning for custody rights. The next day, Claire sat across from her lawyer, Emily, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-30s who exuded calm confidence. Emily flipped through the documents Claire had brought with her, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "He's asking for shared custody," Emily said, glancing up at Claire. "Not full custody, which is important to note. He's not trying to take the boys away from you entirely." Claire's hands gripped the edge of the chair, her knuckles white. "He shouldn't have any custody. He abandoned us, Emily. He left me to raise 4 children on my own while he disappeared. Why should he get to waltz back into their lives, now that it's convenient for him?" Emily leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "The court doesn't just look at the past, Claire. They'll also consider his current intentions and his ability to provide for the children. He's wealthy, and that will work in his favor." Claire's heart sank. She had been bracing herself for this, but hearing it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Emily gave her a reassuring smile. "We fight. You've been their sole caregiver for 5 years. That counts for a lot. And if Richard thinks he can use his money to bully his way into their lives, he's in for a surprise." The weeks leading up to the hearing were some of the hardest Claire had ever endured. Her days were consumed by work, parenting, and preparing for the legal battle ahead. She pored over paperwork late into the night, compiling evidence of her role as the boys' primary caregiver. Emily encouraged her to document everything: medical records, school reports, even the boys' drawings that reflected their happy home life. Meanwhile, Richard began showing up at the park where the boys played. At first, he kept his distance, standing at the edge of the field and watching them with a hesitant expression. Claire's heart pounded every time she saw him, torn between fury and a flicker of something more complicated, something she refused to name. The boys noticed him quickly. Lucas, the most observant of the 4, was the first to ask questions. "Monty, who's that man?" he asked one afternoon as they walked home. Claire hesitated, her throat tightening. "He's someone who wants to get to know you," she said carefully. Lucas frowned, clearly unsatisfied with her answer, but he didn't press further. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, Claire walked into the courthouse with her head held high, Emily by her side. Richard was already there, seated at a polished wooden table with his lawyer. He looked different, tired, perhaps even nervous, but Claire refused to let herself feel sympathy for him. The judge, a stern-looking woman with silver hair and sharp glasses, called the hearing to order. The courtroom was small and quiet, the air thick with tension as both sides presented their cases. Richard's lawyer focused on his financial stability and his desire to build a relationship with his sons. Photos of his sprawling home, glowing character references from colleagues, and promises of a bright future painted him as an ideal father figure. Claire's stomach churned as she listened, the implication that her love and sacrifice weren't enough cutting deeper than she expected. But when it was Emily's turn to speak, she painted a different picture. She described Claire's dedication, the countless sacrifices she had made, and the unbreakable bond she had forged with her sons. Evidence of her sleepless nights, medical records showing her presence at every appointment, and glowing press school reports all worked to bolster her case. "These boys have thrived under their mother's care," Emily said firmly. "She has been their world, their constant, Uprooting them now would not be in their best interest. The most shocking moment of the hearing came when Anita, a former employee of Richard's family, took the stand. Anita, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s, had worked as Eleanor's personal assistant for over a decade. Claire hadn't seen her in years, but when Anita had called offering to help, Claire had jumped at the chance. "I witnessed firsthand the pressure Richard was under," Anita said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "His mother threatened to disinherit him if he married Claire. She orchestrated the entire situation, ensuring that Claire was pushed out of his life." The courtroom fell silent as Anita produced letters, proof of Eleanor's manipulations. The letters revealed the depth of Eleanor's control and the cruel measures she had taken to keep Richard from marrying Claire. Claire glanced at Richard, expecting to see anger or denial on his face, but instead he looked devastated. His shoulders slumped, and he lowered his gaze, as though the truth had finally crushed him. When the hearing ended, the judge announced that she would take everything into consideration and deliver her decision within a week. Claire left the courthouse feeling drained, her emotions a tangled mess of hope, fear, and anger. As she walked toward her car, Richard caught up with her. His expression was somber, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Claire," he began, his voice low. "I didn't know Anita would do that. I didn't ask her to." Claire stopped, her jaw tightening. "Does it matter?" She told the truth. "Your mother destroyed us, Richard, and you let her." He flinched but didn't argue. "You're right. I failed you. I failed us. But I'm trying to make it right now." She shook her head, her chest tightening. "It's too late for that." His eyes met hers, raw and filled with regret. "Maybe it's too late for us, but it's not too late for me to be a father to our sons." Claire stared at him, her emotions warring within her. She wanted to scream at him, to make him feel the pain she had carried for so long. But she also saw the sincerity in his eyes, the desperation of a man trying to rebuild what he had broken. "You want to prove yourself," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Then start by respecting the life I built for them." The week leading up to the judge's decision was agonizing. Richard continued to show up at the park, gradually earning the boys' trust. He brought small gifts, a soccer ball, a book of bedtime stories, and played with them, his joy evident in every interaction. The boys, curious and open-hearted, warmed to him quickly. Lucas, ever observant, began asking more questions, and Claire found herself struggling to navigate the delicate balance between truth and protection. When the judge's decision finally arrived, Claire felt like the world stopped spinning. The ruling granted shared custody. She would remain the boy's primary caregiver, but Richard would have structured visitation rights. It wasn't the victory she had hoped for, but it wasn't a complete loss either. As she stood in her tiny apartment that evening, watching her boys play with the new soccer ball Richard had brought them, she realized something. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would fight to protect her son's happiness while learning to navigate the complicated presence of the man who had once been her everything. Bridging the divide. The days after the judge's ruling were a whirlwind of adjustments. Richard's court-mandated visitation began that very weekend, and Claire braced herself for the disruption it would inevitably bring. She packed a small bag for each of the boys, clothes, snacks, and their favorite stuffed animals, and tried to keep her emotions in check as she explained the situation to them. "You're going to spend some time with Richard," she said, kneeling to their eye level in the cramped living room. Lucas tilted his head, his perceptive eyes narrowing. "He's our dad, isn't he?" Claire swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, he is." Noah wrinkled his nose. "But why wasn't he here before?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut, but she steadied herself. "It's complicated," she said gently. "But he's here now, and he wants to get to know you." The boys exchanged glances, their curiosity outweighing their confusion. "Okay," Lucas finally said, speaking for the group. When Richard arrived, he stood at the door with an uncertain smile, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Claire handed him the boys' bags without meeting his eyes. "Don't be late bringing them back," she said firmly. "I won't," Richard promised, his voice soft. The boys ran to him, their excitement palpable as they bombarded him with questions. Claire watched from the doorway, her chest tightening as they left. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in years, the apartment was empty, and the stillness felt alien. She paced the small space, her mind racing with worries. Would he know how to handle them? Would they be safe? By the time the boys returned that evening, their laughter filled the hallway before the door even opened. They burst inside, chattering about their day at the zoo, their sticky fingers clutching souvenir keychains Richard had bought them. "Mommy, we saw lions," Oliver exclaimed, his face alight with joy. Claire's heart ached as she listened, torn between relief that they were happy and the sting of seeing them bond with the man who had once abandoned her. Over the next few months, Richard's presence became a fixture in their lives. He showed up for every scheduled visitation, never late, and often stayed longer than required just to spend a little extra time with the boys. He attended their preschool events, cheered them on during soccer practice, and even offered to help with school projects. Claire watched from the sidelines, her emotions a tangled mess. Part of her wanted to believe he had changed, that he was genuinely trying to make amends. But another part of her remained guarded, wary of trusting the man who had caused her so much pain. The boys, however, adored him. Lucas asked him endless questions about his childhood, while Noah reveled in Richard's playful energy. Liam and Oliver, the quieter of the four, clung to his every word during bedtime stories. One evening, as Richard was leaving after a particularly chaotic family dinner, Claire found herself stepping outside with him. The boys were still giggling in the living room, their laughter echoing through the open window. "They love you," she said, her voice quiet. Richard turned to her, his expression soft. "I love them too, more than I ever thought possible." Claire crossed her arms, her gaze dropping to the ground. "It's hard for me to see them with you," she admitted, "after everything that happened." "I know," Richard said, his voice tinged with regret. "And I know I can't erase the past, but I want to build something better, for them, and for us." Claire looked up at him, startled. "There is no us, Richard." His eyes met hers, steady and sincere. "Not yet," he said. "But I'm not giving up on the chance to make things right." She didn't respond, turning back toward the apartment. Her heart felt heavier than ever as she closed the door behind her. As the months passed, Claire noticed subtle changes in her relationship with Richard. They began talking more, sharing small moments of connection as they co-parented. He started helping around the apartment, fixing the leaky faucet in the kitchen, assembling the new set of bunk beds for the boys, even bringing her coffee on mornings when she was too exhausted to function. One rainy Saturday, Richard showed up with a stack of coloring books and a bag of groceries. "Thought we could do something together with the boys," he said, setting the bags on the counter. Claire hesitated, her walls firmly in place, but the sight of her sons' faces lighting up at the idea of a family activity melted her resolve. They spent the afternoon coloring, the boys squabbling over crayons while Richard and Claire exchanged amused glances. For the first time in years, Claire felt a flicker of what they had once shared, a sense of ease, of partnership. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Richard lingered by the door, his expression hesitant. "Thank you for letting me stay," he said. Claire nodded, her arms crossed. "It's for them, not for you." "I know," he replied, "but it means a lot to me." The turning point came one night when Oliver fell ill with a high fever. Claire panicked, unsure whether she should rush him to the hospital. She called Richard out of desperation, and he arrived within minutes, his face pale with worry. They spent the night by Oliver's side, taking turns cooling his forehead with damp cloths and whispering reassurances as he whimpered in his sleep. For the first time in years, Claire allowed herself to lean on Richard, her exhaustion outweighing her pride. When Oliver's fever finally broke in the early hours of the morning, Claire sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "You're an incredible mother," Richard said quietly, sitting beside her. She looked up, her eyes red and tired. "I didn't have a choice." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers before retreating. "You shouldn't have had to do it alone." Claire didn't respond, the weight of his words settling between them. Over the next year, Richard continued to prove himself. He showed up consistently, not just for the boys but for Claire as well. Slowly, she began to let her guard down, though the scars of their past remained. One evening, as they sat on the balcony watching the boys play in the fading light, Richard turned to her, his expression earnest. "Claire," he began, his voice steady, "I know I don't deserve your trust, but I have to ask. Do you think there's a chance for us? For all of us?" Claire looked at him, her heart pounding. She wanted to say no, to protect herself from the risk of being hurt again. But the man sitting before her wasn't the same one who had left her at the altar. He had changed, grown, and proven himself time and time again. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm willing to try." Richard's face lit up with hope, but he didn't press her. He simply nodded, his expression soft. "That's all I can ask for." The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but as Claire watched her sons tackle their father in a pile of giggles, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future where forgiveness, love, and family could coexist.